and it was hard to plant and run a mill. So I think it was Mr. Theroux who came up with the idea of recruiting skilled mill workers from back east.
Both sides of the family came here from Quebec in 1911 something. And then, because they were looking for somebody to work at the mill, they told them they'd give them a piece of property. They would supply the wood for them to build a house. And I think they were paying, I think $10 a month seems like quite a bit, but they weren't paying too much.
So for the most part, they were French and Catholic. And the idea was to have them establish and stay, and it worked so well to the extent that they went back and did it again the following year. So, as a long preamble, that meant that, yeah, the French-speaking component was very prevalent in Fraser Mills.
But there's a lot of these pioneers, that's the way they were, or that's how they got started here, that particular way. So, you know, you get a piece of property, build a house. There's not too many of those left anymore.
The housing was all dependent on the mill. Things like you rented your house, you didn't own it. And so it was quite interesting because every 4 years they redecorated it for you. This was all to do with the mill, and new wallpaper, new paint, everything was taken care of by the maintenance in the mill. And of course you didn't have electric stoves, there was none of that. It was wood stoves with sawdust.
We all were one big family here in Fraser Mills. Yeah. It was really ideal. At the beginning, it was just, like I say, the largest mill in Western Canada. There were 1,400 employees down there at Fraser Mills.
I would say 90% of the people worked in the sawmills, and they, like I'd mentioned before, the whole winter time they did nothing. There was no work there. Down the bottom of the hill, I'm more familiar with up at the top of the hill, of course, but the streetcar used to run from New Westminster down into Fraser Mills. It seems to me that it stopped at Marmot, the corner of Marmot, and right at this corner here.
The old tram, one of them referred to it as an interurban, somebody referred to it as a tram, that used to run from New Westminster out in effect to Port Coquitlam, to the railway station out there. And that reminded me that when they closed that, they used to have, I don't know, remember the old Central Park lines or Burnaby Lake lines? They had these little huts, you know, at stops to keep you dry. Well, when they closed it down, those were going to be dismantled, and my father bid on it and got them. He tore them down and sold the lumber. It was sort of the end of the tram.
There's an evolution that's happening here in the community. The evolution is that the French, like my generation, are moving out around in the surrounding communities here. So the Catholic Church now is no longer the communicator because we're all over the place.
I went for a walk in the area, which I didn't know was called Oakdale ever. And this lady came out and talked to me. She says, you know this area is called Oakdale. And I said, she was an elderly lady. And I said, no, I didn't know that. And then I was walking down along Stony Creek, which is behind our property, and I saw this big fallen oak tree. And I thought, oh, oak tree, my goodness, I wonder if there used to be oak trees around here. And that's why it was called Oakdale.
The first oaks that I ever saw, and I didn't even know they were oaks at the time, was on a farm that was long deserted. There was an old farmhouse that stood there, the windows and doors gone, and papers and calendars and that scattered around the floor.
The area was developed before Millardville, long before Millardville, because North Road was built by the engineers, the Royal Engineers, to connect New Westminster with Burrard Inlet, because there was fear over 100 years ago that the Americans were going to invade British Columbia. And because in those days the Fraser River froze over, they were afraid of not getting supplies up the Fraser River to New Westminster, which was the capital for quite a time.
So I decided that I would take these oak, and rather than use them for firewood, I would have them cut up into lumber and build something. And this is, I did, we bucked them into 2-meter pieces and hauled them, and I stored them in my garage.
And then North Road went straight north, up the side of Burnaby Mountain, down to Burrard Inlet. And because the engineers were very concerned that it goes straight north, that they went down a hill, up a hill. They could hardly make it with the horses and so on. But it did go straight north. So in those days, because North Road was developed, then different pioneers came and lived in little spots and farms along North Road.
Well, years passed, 6, 7 years. Spiders and centipedes took over the pile of oak, and the enthusiasm for cutting it, and eventually they got cut up into 18-inch and went into the fireplace, and that was it. So those are probably the last oak trees in Oakdale, and they probably passed through my fireplace. So I feel a little guilty.
Don Cunnings ended up being the Parks and Recreation Director for Coquitlam. And there is a man who deserves a lot of credit for where we are in Parks and Rec today, I'll tell you. Because we had a springboard, a trampoline, and a mat. And Don Cunnings.
Lafarge of Canada leased from the province 120 acres of gravel pit on Pipeline Road, which is now the Town Center Park and the Percy Perry Stadium and Lafarge Lake. But think of it as a 300-foot high pile of gravel. It was a veritable little mountain. And Lafarge of Canada leased from the province this chunk of land. And they mined it down and they mined it down to the point where they were almost at the level of the adjoining road, which was Pipeline Road. And Coquitlam had a long-standing bylaw that said one could not excavate below the elevation of an adjoining road. So here they are, just a few feet above Pipeline Road, when I get a phone call from the CEO of Lafarge of Canada.
When I came here, it was wilderness. I used to work with Boy Scouts for a while, and I'd take them on hikes, like weekend hike or something, and up in Burke Mountain. And I got to know an old guy that worked for the railroad, and he operated the steam engine that hauled the logs off of Burke Mountain. And they hauled them down by rail, and they got down to Burrard Inlet, put them in there, and those logs were so big that they didn't have any equipment here to cut them with. That was before my time. And they used to boom them and take them down to Seattle. That's where they cut them. That's where the timber was cut up.
And the serendipity of the day was the waiter came and filled up our water glasses. And the light bulb went off in my head. And I said to the Chief Executive Officer of Lafarge of Canada, sir, that water in a park is like a fireplace in the front room. So if your company would turn over its 5 acres of freehold land in perpetuity as park to the municipality, and your company would create a man-made lake to our specifications, I would take that concept to council, and I have every reason to believe they'd probably buy into it. And he reached across the table and shook my hand, and that's how a glass of water became a lake.
Of course, Riverview and Essendale were quite large in that day. We used to drive by and you could see all the people working out in the fields. They used to have their own gardens, and the people used to work, used to grow all their own vegetables, and they grew enough for the institutions there, plus Burnaby Jail and many other provincial institutions. And then someone got the idea that they were using slave labor and wouldn't let them do it because it was against their human rights. And so the people that were working there, they loved it. They took a survey. They all loved, because they loved being outside and, you know, working with their hands. And they had a big controversy about, people said it was good therapy for them, and they said, yeah, but they're residents, they shouldn't be. So it was canceled and the gardens all plowed under.
The whole idea from the time that hospital was first built, it was responding to the needs of the community. Right. And like I say, when you start the very first history back in, well, we always say it started in 1850 in Victoria, but then when you trace the history and then how it went into, I don't know how in depth you want me to go, but it was moved over into New Westminster, and then, you know, they purchased 1,000 acres of land out at Riverview site, and then the building was erected, and then there was another one and another one, and it was always because of the needs of the community.
To me, one of the things that's most significant about Riverview, or Essendale as it used to be called, or the Hospital of the Mind as it was called originally, is that whole area of the treatment of the mentally ill is really, really interesting and rich social history. And you know, we had it right here for almost 100 years. And I think there are probably a lot of forgotten stories that could be brought to light.
We were terribly overcrowded in the 50s. The wards were extremely overcrowded. Remember, we'd gone through wars, we'd gone through depressions in the 30s, and hard times. Yeah. And the hospital had to fill a need. And I've never, ever, if anyone ever criticized things, I used to feel very badly because I thought the staff tried so very hard, really hard, all through, really. And even in the 70s and 80s, I thought the staff did an excellent job because Riverview always had to change to sort of meet the needs. I've heard this before, and I know it is true.
Jimmy Christmas and half the council decided that Mr. Edward couldn't put his road through there, so they sent their big machine out and dug holes, the big ditches across the road. And this is all documented. And they cut my dad off, cut us off. We couldn't build a road there, but it was on the road allowance. So my dad was an obstinate little bugger, right? He was not being put off by council and stuff like that. It didn't affect him at all. So anyhow, he just went down and talked to the shovel operator, and when he stopped, he said, you know, bucket down, and Dad sat in the bucket and says, and I'm not moving. And he sat in there until they signed an agreement. It took all night and the next day, and all the councillors were out there and the police and everything else, and my dad wouldn't get out of that bucket. He sat in that bucket until they signed an agreement and filled in all the holes and put culverts in for him, and so it's in there. Called him the Burke Mountain Man. So I've still got the clippings out of the paper.
The young people these days seem to be so busy texting each other, they don't have time for a conversation on the phone or a conversation with an individual. They're just busy telexing here and telexing there, and it's quite different. It's hard to keep up with it all from the way it was many years ago.
We didn't have the electronics like they do. Everybody has a device nowadays, but we didn't have. We had, my father, I think, was one of the first people in the street to buy a television set, and that was possibly that would have been 52 probably, 51, 52 in that time frame. Small 9-inch television set in a great big wooden box, 9-inch screen.
And so, you know, that was new to us. Television had just come in. Otherwise, we used to listen to the radio mainly. There was a lot of good radio programs on in those days.
Right now, with media, you know, the way the media is nowadays, the world is just changing so rapidly before our eyes that you can't, it's sort of mind-boggling. And I kind of sometimes just want to not even think about it, which isn't right, but I think it's, I think we were fortunate. I think I was very fortunate to live where I did and to be raised when I was raised. Even though I was raised in the Depression and we didn't see a lot, I think I was very, very blessed.
But I guess, you know, when I started, when I was logging and doing that and my own business, well, I did Westwood Plateau. We did the same thing there, you know, and people complained about it, and we did College Park and Ranch Park, and, you know, and that's how I made my living, you know, clearing land and making roads and, you know, logging so these things could be built. And it just scares me as I'm getting old now. They're catching up to me. You know, and you know, you look back and think, well, I did that same thing, and all the people were complaining when they were clearing their land, right? You know.